going to start with a panel on clean rooms, and we have three leading experts in the field on this particular issue. Now, clean rooms are coming up, as you probably have heard, in a lot of different fronts, especially in light of the new California law that's gone into effect, where and some of the FTC enforcement actions and the state law actions in which sharing of data for the purposes of surfacing ads on different kinds of platforms, as we all know, has become one of those areas that state regulators and federal regulators are looking at every day. And clean rooms have been brought up as one of those technologies that could help address some of those concerns. So we're going to start out by introducing our fantastic panel today. So Julia Schulman of CORE, please come join us up here. Susan Roll, most recently of Warner Brothers Discovery, and Andy Dale, the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer of OpenAP. So everybody, please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel today. Well, so we're gonna have a really lively discussion on a number of fronts, and I want to thank each of you for taking some time to come join and share some thoughts with the community today. But before we jump in, I always, as you know, as part of the spokes community, we really like to have our speakers introduce themselves, talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today, because so many folks are coming up in our industry every day. So, Julia, do you mind if I turn it over to you first for a little intro?
Sure. Hi, folks. Julia Schulman, currently running an advisory focused on helping companies navigate ads privacy related developments across policy, legal, product, and strategy. But from a background perspective, I've been in the ad space for about 10 years. Started out at AppNexus as a commercial and product attorney, took over privacy there, and then actually had the fortune to collaborate with Susan when she was at Warner on various policy and regulatory related developments. Most recently, I was the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer of TripleLift, which is a supply side platform in the ecosystem. And I've had the good fortune of working with Andy on a number of industry developments and standards.
And I will say, we're going to have to tease it out of Julia, Susan, and Andy, because all three of them are quite modest. Julia is one of the leading experts you will find on what actually happens on ad tech across the ecosystem, from what happens on the websites, what happens in mobile apps, and what happens in connected TVs, and brings a wealth and depth of experience on the technical data flows that I know you're too modest to bring up. So, Julia, I knew I'd have to bring it out of you, but you got to talk about your background more than that at some point during the discussion today. So
I won't bore everyone. Okay. If you want to grab a drink later, I'm around.
Awesome. Okay, Susan.
Well, first, Justin, thanks for having us. The spokes events are always so great, and it's wonderful that they're made available to the whole community. So as Justin and I actually knew each other when I worked on Capitol Hill on the Senate Judiciary Committee back when the Senate was first sort of digging more aggressively into what is commercial privacy. So I worked for Al Franken, and he was the first member to chair the Privacy Technology and Law Subcommittee for the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then I moved to Nike, where I had sort of a hybrid role in legal and government affairs, and really helped them develop their privacy program, as well as grow their IP team, grow their cybersecurity team. So it was a lot of looking at how public policy is shifting radically in this space and creating all sorts of new risks for large companies, even e-commerce companies that haven't really traditionally had to think about data in the same way. And then I went from there to Warner Brothers. It's now Warner Brothers Discovery. It has gone through several different ownership changes in the 5 years I was at Warner Brothers, but you probably know it as CNN, as HBO Max, as TNT and TBS and Cartoon Network and True TV and a gajillion other brands, running a massive theatrical studio that puts out feature releases regularly, creating TV shows like Ted Lasso that then get distributed on other platforms, and running a massive games business with 14 different gaming studios. So that business was, at least from a privacy perspective, you should think of it as a major marketer spending many hundreds of millions of dollars promoting their TV shows and major feature films. You should think of it as a streaming service where connected TV issues are big, but a streaming service running ads now. And what does that look like? And you should think of it as an ad-supported company where CNN is really driven in large part by linear ads. So ads coming on your TV, your regular cable TV, and digital ads on CNN.com. That's really what makes and funds a business like CNN. And there are several other ad businesses, but anyway, just to give you some context.
No, I mean, that's fantastic background, but you basically have a depth of experience on the policy front. And now both through the Nike side, Nike, by the way, is an example company that a lot of panels use Nike as the example because they're advertising, they have apps that collect, data, telemetry, arguably healthcare data. We can ask our colleagues from the FTC later today. And now, one of the major content providers and publishers effectively in the media space. So Susan, thank you for joining. I think the experience you're bringing from that side would really, really help on today's panel. So, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me. I spent 5 years on the legal team at TD Ameritrade, and that's where I picked up a knack for privacy. We were onboarding ad tech at that time. It was the first time I'd heard of anyone using cookies to do any sort of advertising. So I helped Ameritrade negotiate a deal for our first data management platform for ad tech. Then all of marketing became my internal customer. And then I decided, hey, why don't I go into one of these companies? So I did, and I became the first lawyer at a company called DataZoo, which is a demand-side platform, which was acquired by Roku. In my time there, I got to know Julia, and as Justin mentioned, she's literally my first text when I have a technical ad tech question. We text a lot. There are a lot of questions. Ad tech is very complicated. Having colleagues like that is critical. We both served on the board of the Network Advertising Initiative together. That was another really interesting experience in the ad tech space. I left ad tech, went to 2 different marketing tech companies, but adjacent to ad tech. One was acquired by MasterCard, and the other was a B2B gifting platform. And now I'm 2 months into a job at OpenAP, which is a TV ad tech platform, a joint venture of Warner, Fox, NBCU, and Paramount.
Awesome. And Andy also is now a widely followed social blogger, Andy. I see every time you post observations about what croissant you're having in the morning, you get thousands of people engaging with you on their preferred, whether it's jam or if it's, do they want, some other chocolate on? Yeah, exactly. We've done a great job. Honestly, Andy, again, is one of the folks in the industry where if you have a hard question, Andy either knows the answer off the top of his head or he knows exactly who has the answer, which is, yeah. Well, listen, I appreciate you all making time available, and we make these sessions available to the community openly. And one of the things our team at Wirewheel is really excited about is that we get as many views from like law schools and folks on the Hill as we do in industry, and that's always exciting to us. Now, I've asked our panel each to answer one question in 1 minute or less, so that we can frame up the discussion today. And please, for those of you here in person, and I see great friends here with us, please jump in with questions along the way. So the first question in the topics of clean rooms is, what's a clean room? What exactly is it? And you have to answer it in 1 minute or less. Julia, over to you.
I'll try.
Okay.
So clean room, there's so much out there, so many conversations about it, but most people don't seem to know what they are. It is an environment that enables the controlled collaboration between 2 or more parties around data sets. And what that actually means is that it's a secure environment that allows you to control the inputs. It allows you to control the techniques that are used to compare those data sets, sometimes to combine them, sometimes to just see if there is overlap between those data sets. And then most importantly, it enables control over the outputs. And so are you outputting data at a user level? I would argue that clean rooms shouldn't enable that. Or are you allowing outputs that are aggregated that clients can then use to facilitate different use cases? And we'll talk about some of those later, but many of them are applicable in ads, national security, healthcare, you name it.
That was awesome. And 1 minute or less. Well done, Julia. I like that. Way to start. I'll turn the next one over to Andy. Okay. And this question is, in the context of clean rooms, Andy, what's one privacy or data protection problem clean rooms actually do help solve?
I think it helps create a sense of control and a sense, it sort of takes some of the pressure off of the data sharing, certainly when it relates to big companies that have lots of things to consider. When you remove variables like dropping a lot of sensitive or personal information into, you know, an Amazon S3 bucket and somebody else picks it up and then they do something with it, there's just a lot of hops and skips and jumps. And I think that makes people nervous, rightfully so. So I think clean rooms do a nice job of having two parties using similar systems with vetted secure technology to transfer data and rules around what is shared and what is used. So I think the way I think about it is it solves that first and foremost. It solves the trepidation factor first. It doesn't solve everything though.
Well, that's the key. It doesn't solve everything because we have heard of it talked about as a silver bullet. And this is one of the things personally I've been really challenged on understanding, you know, just exactly where the lines are. So for our third 1 minute answer, we then go to Susan. So Susan, what is a thing or a challenge in the data protection or privacy world that you don't think a clean room actually addresses or solves?
So I think all of you that may be working in-house or working for companies or advising companies, I think what Justin's driving at is when you hear from your business clients, from your marketing teams, from your ad sales teams, from your tech teams, that they plan on using a clean room and hence like you shouldn't worry about it. That is absolutely incorrect. Clean rooms are not a panacea for all of the privacy work that needs to go into making sure you're applying consents appropriately and thinking about the obligations you have to the individual, to the consumer usually, whose data you're using. So I think Andy's 100% right. It gives you much more control, especially if you're a marketer and an advertiser, where the whole nature of the ecosystem involves data sharing with many hundreds, if not thousands of players across the ecosystem. And then you don't know what they're doing with your data and frequently may have lost. Like you're essentially losing ownership rights, you're losing control. This environment allows you to dig into the details of what's actually happening and make sure that you understand it, but you need to do that. You have to be able to still think through, where is the data going? How is it being matched? Who's then taking outputs from it? What are those outputs? Are they aggregated? Are they not? So I think it's not a privacy panacea. Let's just say that much.
Well, we're gonna open it up and have a discussion among the group. I know there were a lot of items you wanted to talk about. And Susan, again, that was a great way to frame it in a minute or less, because it's a hard set of issues. I think we've all seen over the last 2 to 3 years, a pretty significant amount of discomfort about people going to any channel, the way I think of it, a website, a mobile app, connected TV. You agree to some terms of service when you land on it. I was talking to Andy about one of the streaming platforms I use personally. When I landed on and opened up and bought that streaming platform, I agreed to a term of service myself, and I actually read these things, but it didn't give me a whole lot of choice to not agree to that. I'd already bought the box. Okay. From that moment on, I don't really personally have any comfort knowing where my data goes when I land on any one of those three things, whether it goes directly from a website to an ad platform, whether it goes from a mobile app to serve me an ad, or whether it goes from the connected TV platform to personalize ads to me. And I think in the last year, those of us that are in the industry, we've seen a lot of focus, first California, now the FTC, on that one thing, that you land on a website as a consumer, your data goes from a website to a third party to surface an ad. So one of the contexts in which I hear clean rooms coming up is that, as Andy was saying, it kind of prevents an uncontrolled, ungoverned sharing of data between an advertiser and a platform without any controls or ability to get the data back in the same way. But the purpose of a lot of the clean rooms concepts are really still to be able to serve an ad sometimes on a cross-contextual basis. And I think that's part of the tension. So I know we had three separate items. We had what is a clean room, what are the good stuff, what are the bad stuff. Julia, could I turn it over to you to start the discussion on some of the topics you guys were going to cover today on these?
Sure. And I'm not playing Facebook. These are my notes, trying to be environmental, and I don't have a lot of paper with me these days, so bear with me. My phone here. And also, if anyone has any questions, burning questions, interesting questions, just wants to say hi. Hi, Amy back there. Please, raise your hand, pipe up. We'd love to just make this as interactive as possible as well. And Justin, feel free to jump in if you've got a question that pops up. So taking a step back, Andy, I'll start with you. We see a lot of news around different clean rooms coming out of some of the big tech companies, some smaller companies that you've maybe never heard of. How do you think about the different types of clean rooms and the different companies providing them? And what are some frameworks and differences you can use?
I think we're in a relatively nascent place for that. I first came across them at MasterCard, and I think they were doing some of this internal. Or vis-a-vis Snowflake, which is probably the largest provider of clean room at current. But there's lots of companies moving into the space quickly. So the answer, Julia, is like, I don't exactly know how to think about it yet. I think we're really, really in the sort of innovation stage of some of these things. Mm-hmm. Snowflake didn't begin as a clean room company. Snowflake has other applications, but clean rooms are becoming, an increasingly important thing. I think there are now verticalized clean rooms that are focused some on healthcare, some on ad tech, some in other areas. I think that's happening.
Andy, for those who don't know what Snowflake is, it might be useful to just tell them a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, or what they're developing and what is a verticalized clean room. Because I think this is an area that's like hyper technical. And at least
I don't exactly know how to think about all the things they do. It's tricky. I think of them as large scale data infrastructure, and that doesn't offer a whole host of better applications, but I think of them in a similar light to the way I think about Amazon and Google Cloud, but not necessarily as a hosting provider, but a large scale data service that sits within those. Yeah.
Cross cloud. Is that maybe Susan were you trying to poke at that? One way I think about it is, right, there's clean rooms that the large cloud providers provide, and you need to decide to use one of those cloud providers in Azure, Google, you name it. There are the snowflakes who actually facilitate and enable data collaboration across the larger cloud providers. There are big brands and publishers and programmers who have their own proprietary clean rooms that they usually run in a Snowflake or they run in an AWS. And then there are the independents, the InfoSums, the Habus, Safe Havens of the world. But I don't know how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, and I would also add, there are clean rooms that brands control, that they built themselves, that are internal to them, that they provide opportunities for their vendors or their partners or their advertisers to bring their data into the clean room and match with the brand or first party's data. And then the insights are sort of aggregated out. And there's different dynamics when you've got a brand or a publisher controlling a clean room versus a cloud provider like an Amazon or a Snowflake or a Google creating a clean room environment that's made available either potentially to a single brand for use across their platforms, like in a Google context, or to multiple parties to come together and it's operating as a third party. And in each of those dynamics, it's different. There's different legal providers and as a result, legal obligations, I should say. So, it's very different if the first party who owns the data is really controlling and managing it in their clean room environment versus relying on a separate third party. And so that's where both the technical requirements come in and the legal requirements. And a lot of analysis has to get sort of done for each one of those situations.
And we touched on in the 1 minute blitz, but 1 minute doesn't do it justice. Susan, do you want to maybe talk to some of the potential privacy benefits of using a clean room? And then I'd love Andy to weigh in on the commercial benefits, because I think it's really important for this audience to appreciate that there is a connection between the two, and there are benefits on both sides.
By the way, do you mind if I ask one thing along the way? Doesn't have to be now. Could one of you or a couple of you just give an illustration? You don't even have to give the names of the companies. You could call them shoe company or publisher or whatever. Did the following using a clean room, and this is what happened, and this is the business problem they solved. In part, I think it would help make it concrete because there's so many different use cases along the way that.
You want me to do that first and then we can riff off that?
Let's do that.
So let's say media publisher sells ad space and has ad exposure data, puts that ad exposure data into its side of the clean room, allows under its own rules what data will be shown to another party. Typically, there will be some sort of ID that's generated at some point along the way. So this is where we can go into the privacy issues there, because your business teams may say, well, it's anonymous, it's pseudonymous, it's not PII anymore. But that's, to your point, Justin, an ID or something is needed to effectuate targeting at some level. So in this case, the example I'm giving, the data goes over and perhaps it's just used for insights. It's used for aggregate insights based on some other data, maybe from a measurement provider. As an actionable report or deliverable, it comes back to show value based on an ad.
So I'm just going to walk through some of the definitional items just to make sure. So in this example, somebody has content and they've published it or streamed it. The data you're talking about is, when you said ad exposure, that data is this ID saw this ad.
Mobile ad ID or IP address.
Saw this ad at this time.
Saw an ad at this time, this day part. There's all sorts of,
well, and this.
And Andy, why is that useful?
I think it's useful in the same way that all sorts of sort of aggregate insights are useful for planning purposes, for the next campaign, or for insights into the value of different media properties.
But isn't it also, at least I think some of what, since these are hypothetical examples, some of what your advertising teams in-house want to know is, was an ad seen so they can get paid by the advertiser? Sometimes they want to know, are we running the same ad to the same people across many different platforms and channels? That's, sometimes referred to as frequency capping. They want metrics to make sure the ad experience isn't terrible, that you're not seeing the same Tide ad every single time that you are in between a particular episode of a show, right? They also want to be able to associate, whether and how long you've seen the ad, to then think about the value of that ad campaign writ large. So how does the ad campaign perform? And I tell you all of this because there are privacy issues with all of these things, but it's really not, none of those things are specific to targeting, which I feel like is an entirely different ball of wax from a privacy perspective. And so there's a lot within clean rooms that I would argue brands benefit from and advertising campaigns benefit from, because they can get a lot of these insights in a way that is more controlled, is more legally defensible, and enables you to run campaigns and still get paid fundamentally.
So that's a great point. And if I could dig into both points. So Andy, before clean rooms, you have ad exposure data. I'm trying to focus on the same language. If I mess it up, you got to catch me. Okay. So streaming platform or publisher has ad exposure data. Before there were clean rooms, how did they share the ad exposure data?
Julia?
So there actually were the equivalent of historical clean rooms where they would use this to do onboarding and other use cases, or they would literally just take the data and put it into controlled environments. And frankly, it was highly inefficient, because we were going to get into this in a moment. But one of the commercial benefits of using a clean room is enabling you to not have to share your data sets with tens, dozens, even hundreds of parties, to use them as vendors to do some of this measurement, reporting, collaboration, you name it.
So theoretically, we're not naming any names, could have happened. You take all this ad exposure data, you put it into a folder somewhere, and your advertisers got access to it and could see which device or IP address saw which ads, theoretically.
Or one of the vendors.
Or one of the vendors. Okay. So that's,
I also think that's piece of data sharing via pixels, which is all sort of automated data sharing. Like it's always hard to think about these tracking tools through any sort of way that like makes sense. But I think I would describe the way Julia's talking about data sharing as more offline, less visible to the individual visiting a website, that their data is getting pulled and shared with third parties.
Or TV, like that was the way TV was operating. But on the web front, Susan's talking about that wasn't happening because there was a way to do it using syncing.
Yes, and using, integrated pixels into websites or cookies. Oftentimes cookies are capturing a lot of analytics data that's driving insights and not specifically for targeting. So it's as all of that is going away, becoming harder to do for a lot of different reasons, including the changes that Apple has rolled out, where you need express consent and opt-in for cross-device tracking in an app environment. Like that is a game changer. And to me, that is ushering in more requirements on companies and on advertisers to think of ways they can accomplish data sharing and advertising, because advertising is, it's changing, but it's not going away. Can you imagine a world where we have no advertising anywhere in the world? Like that's not going to happen. How that advertising is accomplished and what data is being shared to get you ads that are relevant to you doesn't have to be based on your individual website visit to X URL or your app usage of X app. It can be accomplished in a lot of other ways.
well, and then I'll do this one last, I agree with you, and then I'll turn it back over. So now Andy, Susan, Julia, we had the example before clean rooms, okay? You would share maybe some data and that would be used for analyzing the performance of the ad or frequency capping. Now, Andy and team, we have a clean room. So how would that same thing take place technically if you had a really good clean room? Or, you don't have to name a provider, but in the examples you've seen technically, what actually occurs in terms of sharing through a clean room, that same data?
I still think an ID is generated and targeting happens using third parties. But I think the data matching going on in the middle feels cleaner and safer and feels like is less federated across multiple parties.
So maybe the clean room generates a joint ID or something, so neither party has the ID?
It's going to vary this campaign or segments. Ultimately, there's no way to do any sort of ad tech without some sort of identifier keeping going. And this is where the privacy issues come in, right? We're not here talking about the GDPR, but as an example, this type of stuff, you have to view it through a different lens. If you're sitting there trying to do this in Europe, it's going to be very different because the viewpoint of sort of any data derived from personal data is different than it is here. But we're in a world of opacity everywhere. Stuff. It's very cutting edge and innovative. So the answer to your question sort of is, it's happening, but I think we're still in the innovation phase of how it happens.
Yeah, and I would just, I mean, to make it a little bit more concrete. So if a media company wants to target males age 35 to 45 who like zombie and dystopian movies and TV shows, they can provide that data without individually naming all of the John Does of the universe that are all watchers of The Last of Us. Right. And so they can provide the environment in a clean room where you're not sharing specific video viewing information. You're sharing aggregated information about genres, where you're not sharing birth dates. You're sharing aggregated information of individuals that fall into a cohort of a certain age range, where you're not sharing individual identifiers of their CTVs, but they're still extracting to people in those aggregated cohorts identifiers for the people who are going to see an ad for season 2 of The Last of Us, just to pick up, assuming one is going to come out. So that's the kind of thing that I think as a brand, you're much more in control if you structure this the right way and you're very specific about the conversations you're having with the vendors and the advertisers about what they're allowed to share and what they're not allowed to share. You can have a lot more control over how that data is used for targeting and how it's used in a way that's much more defensible from a privacy perspective. And it's different issues, whether you're dealing with like applying opt-outs of sale and sharing in the new CPRA environment, or you're thinking about whether this is legitimate interest issue in a GDPR situation. All are very different, but you're in a scenario where you're in the driver's seat much more than I think you were in the past. I don't know if that makes sense.
I would say maybe to put like a finer point on that endpoint, it's really important what Susan was saying is the main thing is that the outputs, like you control those outputs. So if you're a brand and you want to protect your data and you want to make sure only certain jobs can be run against that data and in engineering lingo, and only certain joins can happen on that data, you can define those parameters with the clean room provider. They might have out of the box solutions, or you might be able to ask them to do certain stuff for you. That is a controlled, auditable, technical environment. And you can say no user level outputs can be made out of this environment. And they can technically prove that they are only providing aggregated reporting, statistics, you name it, back out to whoever came in and collaborated on that data set, versus the current world where data is sprayed all over the place. And you might put a contract in place that said, here's the use cases, here's the purposes for which you can use this data, no more, and you're going to agree to delete it, you name it, when I give you, notice of, but you never really know if that happened. And it is so expensive and I would argue almost impossible to do some of those audits that no one does them. So if you can have these controlled environments and those environments are audited and provable, that's a pretty big win for many of us.
I think to add to that, Julia, I think it's the environment plus the contract. And we're never going to get away from the fact that we need a good contract in place. And so as a practical sort of thought process, whether you're on either side of a sort of clean room related deal, or really any media, thinking really deeply about what you want that party to be able to do or not do with the data and the privacy implications of that. You are a service provider under these different contexts and use cases is really important. Documenting it in a contract is really important. And the same thing goes, what are we, if I'm thinking internally, when we're going to receive personal information, what are we going to do with that data? I'm 2 months into this job with OpenAP, and lots of the conversation is me saying clean rooms don't obviate privacy law. They enhance what we can do. But what really matters is not that we're avoiding getting personal information. We're going to receive it in some way, and we're going to need to do functions with respect to the personal information. But what use case, what context, how are we acting? What are we doing with that data? That's really what people are going to care about and what really matters. And have we done a contract that reflects either what we're doing in the near term or both near term and long term? And so that's really where we're trying to spend our time and expend our energy. Like, let's map out exactly what everyone expects to happen and expects us to do. Are we a service provider or a third party or a business in these particular contexts? And then let's document it.
So the multi-billion-dollar question then, for many folks sitting in the room, whatever role you play, you have a team coming to you saying they want to RFI clean rooms. They're thinking about building one. They just want to understand more. If these don't solve some of these regulatory challenges, and let's unpack that in a second, why would anyone use them? They're very expensive to implement, right? Like what are the incentives, the commercial incentives for people to use these?
I guess I'll take a stab at this one, but Andy, you should chime in, because this is sort of some of why OpenAP exists. I think, I think that savvy companies see data, their first party data, as an asset. And I think savvy companies are realizing that controlling and limiting who is getting access to that first party data is something they need to invest in. Now, not all companies can afford to do this. That's 100% right. But I also think there is increasingly a dynamic in the data ecosystem that we've all been talking about for years, of platforms creating these walled gardens where they're building the architecture and the infrastructure to manage and control their data and to restrict everyone else's access to their data. And if you as a first party data owner, as a brand or a publisher, aren't willing to do the same thing, you're going to end up spending a lot more money on marketing and advertising, spending a lot more money on marketing, getting a lot less money on advertising, and doing all of this with less effective campaigns, less effective, less targeted campaigns. So it ultimately is a dynamic where, like, when you look broadly at like linear advertising is like on a crash course to zero and has been forever. I think digital advertising is under massive attack from the platforms and from the regulators. And those things are pushing the amount of revenue that's coming in on advertising down. I think if you are a first party data owner, the way you get control of that, and this is a very long answer, is that you think about how to better leverage the data you have to your benefit without making it available. Essentially, I think people made it available because it was the easiest thing. It was like, the quickest solution for the quick hit.
Right. Data leakage.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, data leakage is I feel like a privacy professional term that we all know, but when you talk to your advertisers, they just are like, that's how the internet works.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. Why are you asking me that we need to do something different? This is how we've been doing it forever. Why would we need to invest in clean rooms?
Right. But then they say, hey, contractually, right, you've prevented everyone from stealing my data and building profiles and selling my data. And you can say, well, we've got a contract in place, but technically you have no idea what someone's doing with that data once they've got it in their own system. So this is where clean rooms came in.
Yeah. And I was going to just add to that, I view it as a bit of a defense in depth strategy. Contract, clean room, good privacy notice, having a privacy program that you're paying a lot of attention to, making sure the business units know what you're trying to achieve. That's how you win trust, and that's how you get to answers. If God forbid there's, an issue or regulatory discussion, you want to come armed with the things you did, not the things you didn't do or the things you forgot or missed, right? You want that conversation to be, here's what we built, here's what we did. And I think the deeper that is, the more the conversation you would hope could be, okay, we don't agree, let's fix this, or let's change this, instead of you're already in trouble and now you're trying to get yourself out of trouble.
By the way, just to make sure, we always love to make sure, if you're in the room or you have questions, please bring them to the panel.
We have to go soon.
I know. Yeah. So we do. Yeah, please do. And I promised Andy, as you can see, he will be out of here before 1 o'clock. You can see the nerves. Yeah, Julia too. We do have a question from the back. So.
Some other considering what they need, what privacy concerns or regulatory GDPR or
Yeah.
For a clean room. So if you're looking and you're evaluating, it was like Susan and I were actually talking about this, evaluating a clean room, what are you looking for? So I actually think taking a step back. So the clean rooms themselves are going to need to explain, how they operate and what are the techniques they use. How do you control the inputs and outputs? How do you control the parties that you're going to collaborate with? And then kind of your normal laundry list of security related questions, but they really are a vendor that should not have a secondary, ability to use that data. And that first and foremost should be that question. But I think the other piece as a bigger company attorney or someone who's at a startup is actually helping your business understand why it might benefit them to go out and adopt the use of a clean room. And that's really the commercial reasons that we talked about of preventing data leakage, taking back control over data that someone else could mine and resell and reuse. But then the second piece is if you're not the one who's going to be using it, why you need to interoperate with or facilitate the use of them if you work in the publishing and advertising space. So it's really understanding their commercial benefit. And then when you go talk to a potential clean room, can they logically explain to you what techniques they're using, what they do and don't facilitate, how you would integrate with them, and how you would be able to control which parties you're going to be able to use.
Mark? By the way, I'll repeat the questions. From the clean room perspective, have you seen a use case outside of the ad tech space?
Yeah.
And what is it, Andy?
Tons of internal use cases. So internal data sharing, where they don't want different groups to necessarily have to interact with PI. Great use case, like within your own walls, and makes a ton of sense, right? Minimization.
And in the M&A context, I think it's frequently the scenario where, in the course of a transaction, you may need to share certain data sets, or you may share data sets post-transaction. So coming up with ways to do that safely with limitations on what's being seen by either side and without direct export. I mean, you should think of clean rooms as opposed to me sending it straight to you, I'm sending it to some sort of intermediary, either one I built internally or someone else built, and then I'm allowing you only access to certain information as opposed to all the raw data. And that in of itself, if you can grasp that as a concept, there's so many different use cases for it, because there's a lot of dynamics around companies needing to share data, joint ventures needing to share data, but not wanting to share the actual raw data.
It's almost like a bank wire.
Yeah, and actually to your point, so two other obvious use cases are financial fraud prevention. There's a lot of collaboration among the banks and the different providers in that space, and healthcare, and then national security, from what I understand.
There was another question. Did you? A question was, where did the name clean rooms come from?
I don't have any idea, but I got to give them props for
Good
good
marketing.
marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I guess it comes from science, something like that.
We have just a few minutes. Any other questions from folks here? Maybe I'll do one quick lightning. So is Is it your sense that this is going to be most used in the, internet advertising, mobile app, or connected TV, or some other channel? There's just some area you think it's going to be most adopted most quickly?
I think that's an area ripe for adoption, because a lot of those companies are not technology companies. Publishers, whether they're a news company or a media or entertainment company, are content providers first. They're not technology platforms first. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space. I just think they're going to need both the sophistication of the third-party platforms frequently versus building it in-house. And I think those are companies where there's huge volumes of vendors that they use to accomplish their marketing and advertising goals.
Well, I'm going to focus also, you have the Sephora case, the enforcement matter, that last year had some really interesting language in it about sharing of data, not only for the purposes of surfacing an ad, but Andy, a lot of the things you, Julia, and Susan were talking about was about measurement. And there's language in the Sephora press release that says if you're sharing data for the purposes of measuring the performance of an ad, that could be a share of data on, that's governed under California law. Now, one of the examples you gave, it was effectively sharing out the analytics as opposed to the actual data, which is a critical distinguishing characteristic. And then we have a panel as part of Spokes that's a really important line of cases, to Julia's point, in the healthcare space, where the FTC, I'll let them speak for themselves, but it's almost the language describing the settlements in GoodRx and BetterHelp uses data breach language when you're sharing data from a website to an ad platform, if certain identifiers are shared from the website to an ad platform. So you can imagine both of these being benefited or affected by a clean room concept. Do you all have any reaction to that?
Well, I think
In 1 minute or less, Sandy. Yeah.
I think with respect to measurement activity, I think there's plenty of ways to look at measurement as not being targeted ads, and I think that's been borne out more recently by the statement of reasons that was put out by the CPPA. So I would urge you to ask your law firms about that. That's helpful. I think there are some, but it's going to be use case by use case. It's going to be very individualized, but I do think, measurement is different than actual serving of ads.
Yeah, and Sephora is a challenging one because, well, what was helpful to see some of the pronouncements in it, it was not that prescriptive in terms of where they believe the company was truly just failed from a contract perspective versus a technical perspective. And to Andy's point, they didn't dig into the actual back end uses and who was involved in those uses. So helpful at a high level, but I think many of us would like to see some more nuance and better digging kind of as we go down the road.
Terrific. Susan, you get the last word so that we don't make Andy and Julia nervous about timing here.
I would just say, first of all, I think this has been a great panel. This is a super technical area. So I feel like if ever there was a time where you needed an engineer or a technologist, if you're wearing your lawyer hat, to work side by side with, this is it. Because you need someone who can dig into the details around data governance and how these platforms work, and to look at whether the controls are actually structured the right way to limit exactly what Julia is driving at. It's all, we say secondary use, but that really means taking data and using it for something it was not intended to do. And I think that is happening across certain clean rooms. I think that is happening in places where people don't really understand the right way to construct these things. So, if any of your engineers or technologists, or ideally have a law degree and a computer science and engineering background, this is a world where you should really, I think about how you can add value, because I think there'll be a large amount of growth in this space in the next several years.
100%. Great.
Well said.
Awesome. All right. Well, can we get a round of applause for our fantastic panel? Thank you, guys. We're just going to take a quick couple of minute break, and we're back with, as I said, a really important panel on healthcare enforcement cases. So see you shortly.